Welcome to This Explainer. You know, the moment humans stopped wandering and actually settled down into big cities, we hit a wall. A very messy, inescapable wall. Every single civilization has had to face this fundamental biological imperative, the relentless, daily accumulation of human waste. To truly understand everyday life in the past, we have to look past the grand palaces and the famous battles. We need to examine how ordinary people manage their survival, their environment, and the profound, undeniable reality of their own biology.
So how exactly did our ancestors survive their own waste? Think about it. Today, we mostly operate under this comforting, out-of-sight, out-of-mind mentality, right? You pull a lever and the problem just vanishes. But for most of human history, waste was an ever-present sensory reality. It literally shaped architecture, dictated grueling labor, sparked commerce, and built entire local economies. Let's reconstruct this forgotten reality and see how different societies either engineered their way out of or totally capitalized on this most basic human byproduct.
Part 1. The Illusion of the Flush. Early Hydraulic Marvels. Let's step way back into the ancient world and examine the earliest civilizations that treated human waste as a nuisance that just needed to be washed away. Take the Indus Valley around 2500 BCE. In cities like Mohenjo-Daro, they were already utilizing kiln-burnt brick pour-flush toilets and bitumen-sealed terracotta pipes to divert waste straight into subterranean street sewers. It's brilliant. Even more astonishing are the Minoans on the island of Crete. By 1900 BCE, at the Palace of Knossos, they had engineered a pressurized water system. We're talking tapered clay pipes and cistern-flushed pedestal seats discharging directly into local rivers. They mastered the flush thousands of years before the modern era.
Now, let's jump over to ancient Rome and see how this evolves. You've likely heard of the magnificent Roman aqueducts and sewers, like the famous Cloaca Maxima, but the everyday sensory reality of using their public latrines, known as the Forae, was completely alien to our modern concept of privacy. These places were bustling social hubs. Citizens sat side by side on long stone benches over flowing water with absolutely no dividing walls. They gathered there to gossip, conduct business, maybe arrange a meeting. It was a highly visible communal setting that was just as much a part of Roman daily life as going to the baths or the forum.
But the reality of this communal setting gets pretty horrifying when we consider the xylospongium. Also known as a tersorium, this was a sea sponge attached to a wooden stick used by Romans for wiping. And yes, I said communal. After you used it, you'd rinse it in a bucket of vinegar or salt water, or maybe a small trench of running water at your feet, and just leave it for the next person. Because they had no understanding of germ theory, that quick vinegar bath completely failed to stop pathogens. This practice was a massive health hazard. It was basically a super spreader for parasites, parasitic worms, and deadly outbreaks of dysentery.
But here's the crucial catch. That sophisticated Roman plumbing, it wasn't actually accessible to everyone. The poorer masses lived packed into multi-story apartment complexes called insulae. Because the aqueducts just didn't have the pressure to push water to the upper floors, these residents had to rely on simple buckets and chamber pots. And rather than carry heavy pots down multiple flights of stairs every day, people routinely just hurled their waste out the window onto the streets below. Despite strict laws against it, poor neighborhoods were constantly transformed into filthy, foul-smelling, and disease-ridden hazards.
Moving on to Part 2, The Stench of the Castle, Squalor in the Middle Ages.
Shifting from the public sanitation of Rome to the highly constrained realities of a medieval European fortress, you'd likely encounter a garderobe. Basically, this was a tiny room with a simple hole discharging waste down a long chute into a moat or a vaulted cesspit. But there is a fascinating sensory detail about these rooms. These drafty little latrines were also used to store clothing. Now, why on earth would they do that? Well, because the concentrated ammonia gas rising from decomposing urine acted as a powerful natural fumigant. Nobles actively hung their incredibly expensive wool and fur clothing right in the latrine, because that ammonia repelled clothes moths, fleas, and mites. In fact, this is the exact origin of our modern word wardrobe. It comes from the French garde des robes, meaning robes protector.
Of course, those massive castle cesspits didn't just empty themselves. Let's walk through the absolutely grueling life of a Tudor-era gong farmer. This was a completely socially ostracized but relatively well-paid profession, earning about 6 pence a day during Elizabeth I's reign. Because the general public couldn't stomach the sight or the smell of it, they were only allowed to work at night, which is why they were often called nightmen. Starting at 9 p.m., a team would literally descend into a cesspit, shovel the solid waste into buckets, hoist it up, unclog the castle chutes by hand, and then cart all this night soil outside the city boundaries before 5 a.m.
The reality of this labor was stark. The working life of a gong farmer was spent up to his knees, his waist, or sometimes even his neck in human ordure, and the risks were incredibly severe. These pits had zero ventilation, meaning workers were in constant, very real danger of asphyxiation from noxious fumes. Plus, they faced the physical hazard of rotting cesspit ceilings suddenly collapsing. There's actually a famous historical incident from 1325 where a gong farmer named Richard the Raker tragically drowned in his own pit when the rotting floorboards gave way beneath him.
Section 3. The circular economies fertilizing the future.
Let's pivot our narrative away from this Western flush-it-away mentality for a moment and contrast two vastly different systemic philosophies. While medieval Europe was heavily relying on an out-of-sight, out-of-mind approach that severely polluted rivers like the Thames, over in Mesoamerica, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan operated a brilliant zero-waste circular economy. Tenochtitlan was built on an island in a closed lake system with no natural drainage outlet. If they had simply flushed their waste into the water, it would have triggered rapid eutrophication and effectively collapsed their entire aquatic ecosystem. So instead, they treated human waste not as a toxic hazard, but as an absolutely vital resource.
The Aztec solution was the chinampa. These were artificial agricultural islands, often referred to as floating gardens. They were meticulously constructed by staking out rectangular areas right in the shallow lake, and then layering mud, lake sediment, and organic waste within woven reed fences. Because the soil was constantly being replenished with nutrient-rich organic matter, which heavily included human excrement, these incredibly fertile plots yielded up to 7 harvests a single year. That's enough to supply 2/3 of that massive city's food supply.
To actually sustain this, the Aztecs engineered incredibly strict legal and social institutions to seamlessly integrate human waste into their daily survival. Public latrines were positioned directly over specialized canoes. Once they filled up, workers simply paddled the excrement right out to the chinampas. They even collected urine in ceramic jars inside their homes. It was highly valued for its ammonia by textile artisans to bind dyes and by tanners for curing leather. The whole city was kept pristine by a workforce of over 1,000 municipal sweepers, and littering was strictly penalized by law. Honestly, it was a masterpiece of resource efficiency.
Part 4. Japan's night soil market. Excrement as commerce.
Now, transitioning over to Tokugawa-era Japan, we find what is arguably the most highly commercialized and sophisticated system of human waste management in all of history. They utilized something called shimogoe, which literally translates to fertilizer from the bottom of a person. Rather than some top-down governmental initiative, the management of waste in cities like Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo, was handled entirely by private agents. Farmers from the urban fringe, or their contracted agents, would literally travel door to door to actively purchase human waste directly from the city's residents. It was treated as a deeply valuable agricultural commodity, managed through very strict business contracts and regulations.
The sheer economic value of shimogo was just staggering. By the early 18th century, the annual fecal material produced by just 10 urban households was valued at over half a row of gold. To put that into perspective for you, a single row of gold could buy enough grain to feed a person for an entire year. The intense competition among farmers to acquire this fertilizer drove prices so incredibly high that it frequently sparked intense economic conflicts and negotiations.
Because of this immense value, strict legal frameworks had to dictate ownership. In Edo's apartment communities, landlords, not the tenants, owned the exclusive rights to the tenant's solid waste. In fact, one foreign observer in Japan noted something amazing. If 5 people occupied a single room, the sheer value of the sewage they produced paid their entire rent. Human beings, and their simple biological capacity to produce this valuable fertilizer, were factored directly into the cost of urban housing.
And this value completely structured the local economy. Because night soil is heavy and perishable, it had a tightly bound local market radius, usually restricted to about 0 to 20 kilometers around the city. Contrast this with commercial fish fertilizer at the time, which was dried and shipped nationwide. This local constraint created a deeply interdependent, completely circular economy. The city relied heavily on the rural fringes for fresh vegetables, and the rural fringes literally relied on the city's digestive tracts to grow those vegetables. It's a perfect loop.
Section 5. The legacy of waste, reflecting on our modern systems.
So what do all these reconstructed historical realities actually teach us about our environment today? Well, we are slowly coming full circle. Today, we're finally recognizing the staggering ecological cost of the modern flush and the rapid depletion of synthetic fertilizers. We're actually seeing a modern resurgence of these exact ancient ideas. Modern urban centers are increasingly processing biosolids from wastewater to return human nutrients back to agricultural land. Our latest, most cutting-edge models of sustainable materials management actually closely mirror the exact zero-waste principles perfected by the Aztecs centuries ago.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to end on. As we face mounting ecological crises, heavily polluted waterways, and the desperate need for sustainable agriculture, can we truly afford to keep flushing our most valuable resources away? Looking back at the ingenious closed-loop systems of our ancestors really challenges our modern assumptions about waste. It proves that sometimes the key to surviving our future is buried deep in our past.